So in addition to an epilogue, the book is divided into 3 parts: radical doubt, radicalizing thought, and radical hope. And in the second section of radical doubt, called Order, you describe the events surrounding the creation of Aftermath. And you cut yourself off with no again. And it's somehow charged for me with this beautiful phrase from the opening section, which is, an event happens and happens and happens. This is a definition of trauma. Later, we hear from Jennifer Wallace, who writes, the repetition is an indication of a lack of resolution, the lack of a conclusion. Can you give us a sense of what it was, I suppose, what you were thinking as you dove into the wreck, as you say, and you tried to tell the story of this day and what led up to it?
Thank you so much, Alice, for having me to speak about this book. So, of course, the idea of diving into the wreck comes from Adrienne Rich's great poem on trauma, and from a feminist perspective, looking for something when you feel like you have no idea what you're going to find, but knowing that you have to go somewhere that feels quite deep to get those answers. And as I was writing, I was wondering, or preparing to write, I was thinking about where to begin. And it felt to me like there was no real beginning to this event, because it could not start as a single isolated incident that just came from nowhere. That felt dishonest to me, because I was involved with it before it started, before that day came. So I knew there was a backstory, as it were, and I knew that that story had lots of dimensions that I was also unaware of. So it was really important to try to show through the actual writing and the aesthetics of the book that this attempt to start to talk about something traumatic can often take several attempts, and it can take us into different entry points, which then start to unravel some of the structural issues and discriminations that might lead up to a moment of violence. And so the book really begins with thinking about the initial shock, and then it goes back into trying to work out through writing again and again where a beginning point might be.
I think it's important, right, because each beginning point, if you were to only start there, that tells a particular story itself, as if each opening has its own kind of meaning.
Right. Yeah. So some of those entry points and those beginnings are, was it the morning of 29th of November 2019? Was it the moment when someone is convicted to high security prison? Is it the moment when their parents arrive as first generation immigrants in the UK? Is it the moment when partition of the Indian subcontinent happens? Where do we begin with a sense of generational damage, with a sense of trauma that might lead to a person coming of age at a particular moment in history in the UK and fulfilling all of these other traumas through some terrible decisions that he then went on to make?
Can you tell us, for anyone who doesn't know in the audience, essentially what happened on November 29th and this moment of violence and how you were involved in it?
So the book is about a man. It's about many things, obviously. So I am a creative writing educator. I teach creative writing. And for 3 years, I taught creative writing in a high security prison called HMP Whitemoor, which is just near Cambridge. It's about Cambridge City. It's about an hour away. One of the students in that class in my first year was released after a time, and he went on to commit a terrorist atrocity in London on 29th of November, when he was invited to take part in an alumni education celebration of 5 years of the program Learning Together, which was run out of Cambridge University, which takes young people from the university into prisons to learn alongside incarcerated men. And that's the creative writing program I was teaching. I was teaching for Learning Together. And on that day, the people that he attacked were people he knew from that program. And he killed 2 of them. one of them, Jack Merritt, was my colleague. And the day before he died, we had been teaching together inside the prison. So for me, this was an incredibly complex and difficult knot of knowing both the perpetrator and victim in a very particular way, and something that I had to think through, not only through that relationship as an educator and a writer, teaching creative writing, but also someone for whom my South Asian identity put me in a different relationship to the perpetrator, who was Muslim, whereas he was born in the UK, he was 29. My parents Indian, so, you know, I'm a bit older. And yet there's something about being South Asian in Britain which connected us in this moment. And I had to answer for that quite a lot after this event happened. So I began to think very much about what it meant to be all of these things in this body as a teacher and a writer, and to have also lost someone who I considered a very important colleague.
And there's also just the emotion, capturing the emotion of receiving the news too.
Yeah, so on the day after the attack, we kind of knew something had happened in London, but I didn't really put the pieces together. And then, of course, it was big news because it was 2 weeks before the general election. And this event took place in London Bridge, which was, you know, the heart of power in many ways. And we read about it in the newspaper. The victims' names had not yet been released by the time that newspaper articles were written, but the perpetrator's name was. So immediately I sort of knew that this was the person who had done it. And I had published him in a student anthology. I remembered his, you know, writing that he did, and with his classmates in prison. And he was in the first cohort of students that I taught.
So I suppose, as you say, this is one story of many stories, and you ask this question, how far back must we go? And you do kind of skip all around the last, let's say, 100 years, a bit less. And there's also the question, as you gestured towards, of form, of how to capture this formally, aesthetically. And you're going to read a bit, just so you can hear what this kind of sounds like. And certainly, you know, this is why you must buy copies afterwards, because you need to really see it on the page, because I think reading it does not capture the gappiness, and certainly some of the punctuation points that are used throughout in really innovative and interesting ways.
Before I read, I just want to say that often in these audiences, there are people who have had experience of violence and state harm, and or know people who have been incarcerated and then released. And so I really appreciate people coming together to think about this book and to think about these kind of difficult questions. And I hope that we can create in the room an atmosphere of care and understanding, because we don't get to think together about these complex issues that often. And I'm going to take you back now to the moment of realization. It is a bright morning when the call comes. Everything becomes brighter, like a vision of a nuclear blast in a film. It is as if everything solid has broken into pieces, as if the world has cracked. It is a shivering and unshakable sickness. It feels like concrete in the stomach, shattered and stark as ice on deep water struck with a blade. Like being held under, lungs filling, sorrow deep enough to drown in. And this is a failed attempt to say. It feels like being locked in a dark room, screaming, alone and falling. The repetitive rhythm is not a glitch. It is an artifact of pain, repeating. It feels like being constantly watched. It is an assault. It is a wailing. It is being forced into a nightmare without being allowed to sleep. It is everywhere, as if all the masks have dropped. It is living in the real, and it is the remembered real. This is a shattering, a textbook version of trauma as an extreme cliche. The silence after an echo of a stone pounding. It is begging, no one hearing, like losing a mind while breathing and smiling. like a hand around the throat, forced deeper into the wreck of it. A rage like raging. This is the core of the atrocity, the outside world turned inwards. There is so much violence. It is mainlining butterflies, it is swallowing nails. It is being hollowed, scraped out, as if saturated with a secret that must only pour from eyes. The wind exists only as pine trees moving. Trust, the elixir, seeps from our bodies, always too far away to feel. We cannot stand. There is just skin and hair and fragile bone. It is like being stabbed from the inside, being held under, struggling still, not wanting to move, holding out a hand, finding nothing, losing any grip, being interrogated by buildings, by streets, by your absence, the air, standing in silence. What is left? It is a heart broken. There is no syntax or simile to do justice to this, no metaphor, as if to speak would be more violence. It was as if I had lost language, been forced to the outer edge of words, left with a body that even Antigone would refuse to hold in her arms. It is the immediate aftermath. I am living at the center of a wound still fresh, inside only silence. I have lost all sense of countable time and all respect for aesthetics, or that which, Audre Lorde writes, pertains to things perceptible to the senses, that pertain to things material as opposed to things thinkable. The unthinkable has happened. It is here. I can only bear this body, these words, heavy in plea to others' words, as the I is not only mine, it belongs to many.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause, please? Later, you write of the project of it, you say, I tell myself that I'm writing a lecture, an essay, a memoir, a story is a fiction I tell myself. Time strung out, time withholds. It will not conform to endemic structure. Unruly connections fuse and break. These moments of defy narrative cohesion, which offer no protection in a state of going mad. I thought this was a nice counterpoint to this, to what you've just read, because we hear structured breakdown, and you gesture to this in this passage. And I thought it was curious that you used the word endemic, it's of a sickness. Can you talk about how the language and the structures that you felt you were using to recreate this book themselves are sick in the contemporary literary world?
I mean, the sickness that the book is referring to is the racism of the UK system, of the school to prison pipeline and the prison industrial complex, which really focuses its attention and energies on incarcerating young brown and black men into the system from a very young age. And that really begins in the school system. So it begins with the lack of education into origin stories and histories, shared histories like transatlantic slavery and partition, indentured labor, and all of the kinds of threads and things which are the formation of the reason why our communities are born in the UK. This is not taught in British schools, okay? So when that void happens, there's a kind of psychological thing that goes inside a child, inside a mind that says, who am I? And decisions have to get made at some point about how to integrate one's home life, one's mother tongue, one's cultural life, one's food, one's generational memories, family members with the outside world that one lives in. And if you are also in an area of structural poverty and discrimination, a class system, which is constantly telling you you're going to be a terrorist, you're going to amount to nothing, you are going to be policed, it's easy to disappear from school. It's easy to become at 14 completely lost. And then suddenly I'm describing a trajectory which sounds textbook, but this is actually what happened to this perpetrator. He resurfaced at 19 and was sent because he had become radicalized through the algorithms that were existing online, which filled this void in his identity. And he was sent straight into high security prison, okay? it's the worst thing we can do to citizens in the UK in our own borders. And into that system at very young age, and released on a point of law at 29, so 10 years of formation in that system, with no parole, with very little oversight, with he was wearing a tag, okay, so he didn't just go to London having been released on a whim. He was able to do that because MI5, the Home Office, and all of these other agencies that were meant to be protecting us, the wider community, let that happen. They allowed him to go on that event to London. He had all these conditions on him, so he wasn't allowed to get on the train. He wasn't allowed to use the internet in particular ways. All of these things were phone, and certain of these things were relaxed so he could get on the train and go to London and take part in this alumni event that day. So the book's really looking at structural failures in all sorts of different ways, but it's also looking at some kinds of structural failures in our literary culture and critiquing the idea of whose voice gets to be heard, how that voice is represented. In my first medium, which is fiction, I never intended to write anything resembling a memoir, especially not something in the first person. It's not something that I was that interested in doing. And how palisading in culture and storytelling and myths that pervade our society can feed part of what's going on here. One of the things that was so clear from the inquest into this event was that Cambridge University was considered a protective factor by the prison, by probation services, by MI5. But how can that even be possible? It's because of this mythology of kind of the aspirational narrative that if we can access something like Cambridge University, therefore we must be redeeming. And this word redemption, of course, has this very, very Christian connotations, which bolt on in fiction to this idea of the hero's journey. Let's call it the hero's journey, which is such a pervasive myth in our cultural life. Meeting an idea in South Asian cultures where education is considered to be a way out of poverty and a way out of all of these different things, and the pressure to make up for that those lost school years and prove yourself in some way. So it's kind of like a perfect storm into which a person who has had difficult life experiences and radicalization and so on probably can't survive into a wholeness, and as we've seen very tragically with the loss of 2 young people, could not. And the book's trying to show that through the way it looks at literary culture, fiction writing, aesthetics. It's pressing language all the time to think of the idea, think about what we're doing when we use certain words, like terror, radical, revolution, and so on.
You mentioned your career as a novelist, and maybe some people here know you for your first book, but you're also, as we were talking, you're a professor at Newcastle of Literature, and that's what struck me in the book, with it. There were 2 conversations happening. There was a very theoretical conversation about abolition, about incarceration. You looked at people like Bell Hooks, Adrienne Rich, Toni Morrison, Don DeLillo, and then there's also your sensitivity and prowess as a novelist, just capturing the experience of this. And I thought that these 2, people kind of collapsed in this one paragraph that I wanted to read. So you write, and prison itself is built to be psychotically, not only psychologically dislocating, which is another way of saying it's built to shame. She, not carrying keys, experienced the geography of the place as carceral in the sense of being led through the maze. That's part of the point of it, after all. We don't need Foucault to walk the long corridors and feel their effect on us before it becomes the internal map of our place in this world right here. So I suppose as you were processing and working through all of these various stories and their aftermaths, when did you feel like you did need Foucault? And when did you feel like really that there was a kind of lived experience that you needed to capture? And how did you reconcile these two parts of yourself?
In many ways, I love this question because you're asking about writing as process. But I think I should explain that this book was written in 2020 and across 2020 and 2021 during the lockdown. So in the Northeast, where I live, it was tier 3, which meant it was extremely closed. It wasn't just a little bit closed. It was very, very, very closed. Everything was closed. So I had just moved from Cambridge all the way to the north, and my things were in boxes, and I didn't really have access to a lot of my books. So I had a handful of books that I had that I kind of keep ready access to however much I'm moving around. And they were the friends that I turned to see if I could find ways in and webs of connection and places I could go to find advice and answer, what happened. And the rest of it just happened very organically. Like sometimes theory relies on fiction to make its point. And that suddenly felt to me like a huge lie, because I'm a fiction writer and I had taught creative writing in the prison, and yet this thing had happened. So how can we turn to the flawed characters that fiction writers make up to prove philosophical or moral points? It just felt like there was something really wrong there. And, then we never know who the writer is that's making up that character and what their biases are, how they're going to build that character, and so on and so on. So then the lived experience, as you call it, becomes really, really important. Before this event, I had never wanted to write about my teaching in prison because it didn't feel like something that was ethical to do. I didn't go into prison in order to write about being a teacher in prison. I went into prison to teach them people how to be writers. And they do not have access to publication in the sense that I do. So to use their stories and their lives and their experience of what, of living in that place as a way for me to write something, didn't feel right to me. But after this event happened, to contrast that experience of me going in as the teacher and working with them to make writing with how it's written about in philosophy and in literature felt like the way to make sense.
I also wanted to ask you about the question of person, because you talk in the book about the second person. Can you just, because not everyone's read it, talk about your decision to write in the second person and what that meant, and at other moments when you write in other persons?
Yeah, so the book's written, and it's not only in the first person, it's sometimes in the second person, and it's sometimes in the third person. And the third person parts are usually where it felt like that person who was me just doesn't exist anymore, because trauma does that to you. And I'm sure that most of you have had those experiences where something so shocking has happened that the life you had is gone, and the person you were in that life feels like it was somebody else. So to write about that person with compassion and to hold the sanctity of those good memories, because teaching in prison can feel like a privilege, and working in extremely difficult environments with people who essentially are grateful that you are there to spend that time with them is a huge responsibility. But I didn't have access to those same feelings when I was writing about it because of the shock of what happened. And that person had their own naivety, which I feel like had to be protected. So the third person, the she, was very useful to me in terms of craft. The second person comes in where, again, it's a little bit more immediate. And I think I found my way back to writing in the first person towards the end of the book.
And for the second person too, though, you point out, I'm just quoting you here, you say In fiction or writing about terror, the second person becomes a formal response, voicing trauma as a way of building empathy. For writers of South Asian origin, it seems to bring the sense of the other closer than the first person. It offers a complicated ambivalence and the familiar experience of self as ambiguous. So it's also reflected in this way.
Yeah, so when a fiction writer uses a second person, for example, in a book like The Reluctant Fundamentalist by Mohsen Hamid, it's written in the second person. It's like an address to the reader to ask them to think about the person who becomes frightening in a very particular way. And that book is a bestseller. It's sold all over the world. There's probably several copies in this library. I'm hoping it's not really up my shoulder. And I kind of wanted to put some pressure on the idea that fiction builds empathy, because I'm not sure it always does. Does it just make us feel better because we read a book? That's great. But having read that particular story, does that mean we're going to think differently about a person who commits a terror attack or a person who's incarcerated for that? I don't know. The comfortable idea that somehow fiction can build empathy needs us to question it. And I think as writers, that's our responsibility too.
There's the question, and this is another conversation in the book about essentially about the role of art in society. There's a question of reading art, receiving art, being on the receiving end of it. And there's also the question of making art. So you ask the question, does making art, wanting to be an art maker, make anyone less likely to harm?
I think that the need to make art, the need to represent something on a page or on a wall or on a canvas or on a stage, or through song, is a sort of fundamental human instinct. It's just energy, creative energy. Cave paintings were not made in a classroom. They were made because someone wanted to represent something about the world they saw around them on a wall. And does that mean that person then didn't go and commit an act which we might find morally abhorrent? It is possible to make beautiful art and also not be a very nice person. That is a logical truth, right? We all know that. And yet there was something about the teaching of art in prison, which we make hope out of, that somehow if these people who have done things or been judged to have done things that have put them in prison can also make art, there must be hope, there must be something good. And I think, again, that's something I really want to put pressure on as well. It may well be true that people can find a sense of purpose through making work. How much that sense of purpose can survive in a hostile environment is another question. How much that desire to keep creating as opposed to keep destroying requires communities of care and better services and more libraries and more careful spaces and a social world that has many parts in it that are all at an equal level for a dignified life. It is very, very difficult to use the rationale that because someone can make art, therefore they must be on their way to becoming good. I can't buy into that.
Your descriptions of places of care, of places of community, strike me so much in contrast with your descriptions of the experience you had in prison, but also just the research that you did around it. Can you tell us about your stance on this very charged topic of abolition and incarceration? Your thoughts, maybe stances.
When I was thinking about this work, I've seen what damage high security prison can do, and I've seen the damage that a shaming education system can do, and not just on the perpetrator of this event, but on children and young people growing up through many different types of worlds. And I really think to think about those things is really to think about abolition of structures of knowledge and ways of thinking about each other, which we can work on all the time, to create different ways of understanding, different ways of communicating, and different ways of building societies that don't take capitalism as a fundamental building block, that don't want us to always think that if we're born in a certain place or certain way, therefore the only way out is to prove something through rising into a wealth bracket that therefore, you know, you can commit harm and no one will catch you. Or you can commit mass harm and it feels like, you know, just war or whatever. That's where I am with abolition. And the hardest question, it's a, you know, it's an American term. It comes out of a long history of civil rights movement. We're very lucky to have the thinkers who have done the hard work over generations, and to be able to think with the language that they've developed about the difficult concepts of how to live in the world, how to create more fair and equal societies, how to see each other as equal humans and not some kind of service provider. Perhaps there is a sense even now that we're all engaged in this work of abolition, even if we don't realize it. I certainly think that's true.
We have these conversations.
Yeah, we're having this conversation, and it is a conversation between you and me and between us and all the thoughts in the room and the people. I mean, some of you are nodding, some of you are sort of thinking about all the things you're doing. And we're making a kind of different way of thinking about very, very complex, difficult, emotional things. At the crux of it, ask us to consider, what is the role of punishment and how does it manifest all the way through life in our world? And what do we really want from that constant punitive system? What do we expect from it?
It's a complex question, and it finds itself in a very complex structure that you call the atrocity, which is a kind of totalitarian, and it has branches in education, in politics, in the justice system. Can you tell us about this term and what you mean by it? Because it recurs throughout the book.
Okay, so I'm multilingual, and language is really important to me, to press language for all of its different meanings. I was thinking about the idea of the atrocity. And of course, an atrocity suggests a singular event, like I started with, that seems to come out of nowhere. There's often a way of thinking about geography where we like to believe that, you know, high security prison, and the prison, once you go to prison, you sort of disappeared from society and you don't exist anymore. We can go about our lives in safety. And on the other hand, then, you know, you've got somewhere like Cambridge University, this very elite temple of knowledge. And these two places are not supposed to exist in the same world, but of course they do. They exist in the same space. When I started thinking about how using a word like atrocity suggests a singular event, and knowing that wasn't true, something about multilinguality allows me to break that word into two parts. And the etymology of atro as kind of cruel and black, when it goes back to, you know, the roots of the word atro, and then this idea of the city, which now holds all of us, the university and the prison within it. And it's a very simple breakage of a word to say something about the culture and the landscape in which an event like this can happen. And that holds everybody in it, in a sense, in a community. I think I owe quite a lot to the poets, because compression is a really important part of what this book is doing, compression in language. And as soon as I broke that word into two parts and started thinking about how this kind of epicness of it could be referenced, then suddenly the book took on, and the layer of talking about narrative myths that underpin our lives.
I wanted to ask you about this word, and I also wanted to ask you about this refrain that recurs throughout the book, which is a lament. You say, "Who will gather and hold these fragments? Who will? Oh, who will?" Can you tell us about this kind of through line tradition of lament. And then I'm looking at the time as you turn from lament ultimately at the end to radical hope.
Yeah, so connected to this idea that somehow there was some epic underpinnings to all of this, and I reference Antigone, and it gives you the scope to connect all of these ideas through history right to the present day. The idea of the lament suddenly became really important because obviously it has that group aspect to it, the choral aspect to it, the tragedy that can be reflected on while it's happening through a question to those who are listening, to those who are reading. And obviously it's a question to the reader. And as soon as you do that on a page, the reader becomes the answer. They are holding the fragments, they are gathering the knowledges, they are putting together all the pieces of this text.
Well, there's the reader, but then there's you actually, finding the space and the time and moving past the immediate shock to start to write. Can you tell us about that kind of the third part of the book as you start to gather these pieces and sift through the stories and the aftermaths, and how to start that?
One of the things the book really critiques is the Bildungsroman as a form of writing, which second generation British Asian writers are encouraged to write in order to be published. Right? It's like very unusual for a writer from an immigrant background to start their first book with something that isn't about the aspirational journey of arrival. All right. And so that was really a problem. And it was one of the problems that I think fed into how Usman Khan, the perpetrator of this, was perceived. So I wanted to think about that, and yet this book does turn out to be some kind of Bildungsroman, because like you say, it starts with a shattering, it starts with fragments and trauma. And I was building my way structurally and psychologically to a point where I could write in whole sentences, paragraphs, and make literary critical arguments again, because all of that just seemed to have gone out of the window, broken into pieces, the ability to think coherently at the very beginning. And so it was only through writing the book and putting these fragments into some kind of concreteness on a page that I was able to then finally get to the stage in the final section of the book, which is called Radical Hope, to think coherently about criticism and its role in society again, and then contrast that, like I said earlier, with the actual experience of going back into prison and teaching there. It took me a long time to access those memories again.
You use this word time and you write, time allows me some grace. Her construction, we, the heartbroken, opens a moment of clarity, allowing me back into a pure grief. It is a call to find in community the sense that there might be a return from the event as shattering of trust. This is the kind of mourning the state does not want us to participate in, that it fears from us.
Yes, that's true. I think once we start to acknowledge that not just one person's life is shattered, but everybody's together. And I think during the pandemic, this became more and more clear that we were living this time of collective grief where it was happening to everyone all at the same time, at different levels. Obviously, those people who were frontline workers in the UK, often from minorities, communities, feeling it much harder than in different ways than other people, but there's still a collectivity about it. And once we all recognize that and start to do something, we get situations like protests. And then we get governments cracking down on our rights to protest, which is basically where the UK is at now. So, yeah.
And France.
And France. You know more than me about that.
As a way to transition to audience questions, I'd like to ask you to read the ending.
Okay, Alice asked me to read from the ending, and I'm going to, and I hope you'll just bear with me because I have never read this part of the book before. November 2020. Creative work keeps going alongside grief. I walk 15 miles from a historic heart of the Industrial Revolution, where the Victorian tunnels are now a schoolchild's living classroom, where remnants of coal and shipping across the empire are still felt in a shoreline, still heavy with the leakage of tar into water. I arrive at the coast. I make spirals in the sand. Aware of the difference between doing this and capturing it in writing. Still in the maze of this draft text, I make a list of everybody that we are meant to trust. I wade into the sea. I realize the only body missing is my own. Here is my final arrival, the zenith of this building's Roman. In the architecture of the atrocity, I was considered the teacher, only there to deliver the sessions. But the privilege of teaching and of writing fiction in this world asks so much more of me. It has always meant insisting more, speaking up more, listening more to different forms and lives, again and more. Trusting that instinct that says we are not safe, something must change, and saying it, doing it. This time needed more. Forgiveness for that betrayal of self. Living with what if will take a long time to find, as might new worlds to forge. We can sound sorrow but cannot end on it. Now I follow the form. Even as in sunlit corners and on the steps of the Guildhall in Cambridge and on London Bridge, flowers are left for the memory of Jack Merritt and for Saskia Jones. New dishes are cooked in families, photographs are shared, poems weave voices together. Creativity marks, makes life. Loss in flux to rage and back to bittersweet. This event and its stories have such vast ramifications for so many. It will stand as a turning point among all the other paths a life could take. The words that keep me in this world are only here. I leave them for everyone who falls to violent harms, out from the wreck towards some new imagined future, where attempting to live with clarity in the struggle seems an everyday affair, as possible as it is necessary after all. I know we cannot lose anymore. The atrocity cannot consume us. There is no time, no sentence that can contain. I am standing on the parapet with a lit match in one hand and a writer's love of dry paper, and then the flood. Light changes underwater, and through the refraction, the wreck might disappear. We do not want to make it new. We need a different kind of ship to sail on a collective breath, taken and exhaled. Somewhere, an equal city is being written. It will spread.
Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause? Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much for listening. I suppose when we get to this section, I always wonder who in the audience has had experiences of violence in prison and so on. When I do these events, and people who've read the book often write to me and share things that have happened to them. So the reception of the book, really has been quite moving. People who've had things happen to them and then seen people they love perpetrate harm, and then seen the state crash down on that person and so on. And I think those threads of shame and guilt and trying to work out how we process violence in our lives and our worlds is really what people find with this text.
I want to ask a clever question. I probably won't. The things that really that have really resonated with me listening to you, and obviously I've read the book, the things that have really resonated with me listening to you are the things that give me hope. I have history of violence, I have history of trauma, I have history of those things get repeated and repeated and repeated, and that's how I know it's trauma. But your radical assessment of hope, and particularly the piece you read at the end, I find most moving. I know you're speaking about a specific event, but I wonder if you realize how universal some of the things in Aftermath are for those who have experienced any other kind of trauma or other kind of perplexity, disenfranchisement with the world that they live in. Is that a question, Preti?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And it brings me back to where I started really with Adrian Rich. So Adrian Rich's poem, Diving into the Wreck, really was the thing that gave me permission to write the book. I really wasn't sure what to do with all of the things that I knew and wanted to say. And the book's based on not just my personal experience, but sort of 3 months of inquest statements and documents. This thing went on online because of lockdown for a very long time, and many people gave evidence, and I scored through all of that evidence to sift out what I wanted, but I still didn't know quite what to do. And then one day I was in my office at Newcastle, and I happened to open her book, a collected poems and the forwards by Claudia Rankine. It's a wonderful collection. At Diving into the Wreck, which is of course a poem I know very well, and the poem itself is about feminism and a woman trying to go into the ocean of knowledge to work out where violence against women has happened. But because the language of poetry is so expansive and allows it, and it holds so many of us, it's through that language that I was suddenly like, oh, I can do this because I'm the diver that she is talking about. And I found that connection through poetry, even though the poem itself in its context is about something completely different. And so that was the way in. So, I mean, I'm touched that you think that the book will resonate with different people in different kinds of emotional experiences of their own trauma. And I think I owe that to her. Yeah, that's the same with poetry. Right. That's why things last.
Whereas a language that is spiritual, that brings resonant hope to intellectual language and to trauma. That I think that for me is encapsulates why you that's how I felt.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have the microphone so everyone on Zoom can hear what's going on.
Hi, you mentioned that you taught creative writing in prison for 3 years. Is that meant to imply that you no longer do that? And if you do or do not, I'm assuming this event is a big part of that decision making. If you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, it was 3 years. It was from 2017 until the end of 2019, and then 2016 to 2019, and then in 2020, when Britain went into lockdown, the UK's prisons were also locked down in a much harsher way than people who thought that it felt like being in prison when they were in their homes, right? So men were kept in their cells for 23 hours a day, isolated from each other inside the prison, and some were only allowed out for 1 hour a day. No family visits, no online communication with family members. The prison system is so disenfranchised in itself. It's so underfunded, and there's so much violence inside those spaces that the only thing that this pandemic did was make that worse. And even if I had wanted to, I wouldn't have been able to carry on. So that was the picture in 2020. And I think that went on into sort of mid-21. So I wasn't able to go back. And I'm kind of skirting around the emotional heart of your question is, do I want to, and will I go back? And I think, you know, I'm not sure. That's the honest truth. I will, I think, but in some ways, I don't know. I know that moment's waiting for me. And at the same time, I have to say, there was a group of students from Cambridge University who were with me and Jack the day before he died inside Whitemoor, and we were working there. Some of them have gone on to work in the prison system and carry on making sure that people who are incarcerated have access to writers and poets and creatives, or they work in homeless shelters or refugee charities and so on. Their commitment is what makes me think I will go back.
It's more of a thought, and that I'm trying to work my way through. And something you said struck a chord when you spoke about multilingualism as a way of, addressing certain things. How does that help non-hierarchized thought?
Oh. Well, I think when you have many languages working in your mind, and none of them, I'm not sure it does help non-hierarchized thought, because I think in my own experience, the language of my parents is an intimacy. It's an intimate language. It's the language I think of in my mind when I'm telling myself off. It's the language I comfort myself with. It's the music in that language I listen to when I want to feel their love around me when I'm not with them. My mother died when I was 27. So there is a hierarchy in my own mind. That language is like very close to my DNA. And then English is the language of education, of performance, of writing, in a particular way of making argument, and it has its own place. But when I start writing fiction, then things interesting start to happen. And in this book too, one of the themes that runs through the book is about water. And there's a kind of anagram I use in the book where I talk about water as anagram for pain, because the Hindi word for water is pani, and that's spelled P-A-N-I. So it's just a rearrangement of this idea of pain. And the reason that connects is because when partition in 1947 happened into India and Pakistan and what is now Bangladesh, one of the things that was divided was the rivers. And this created a geographical sort of need on the Pakistan side, because the British dividing line privileged water to the Indian side, where later a dam had to be built in a place called Azad, what is now Azad Kashmir, which is on the Pakistan side of the line of division. So this huge dam was built, the Mangla Dam, and it displaced communities, Mirpuri communities from that region, who were encouraged to come to Britain and take up jobs in the Midlands, in working class areas, to fulfill the labor shortage that had been left by the war, Second World War. And that is the origin story of Britain's biggest Muslim community, South Asian Muslim community, including the perpetrator of this act. Whereas I come from the Indian side, and my immigration story, my parents' immigration story, is a little bit more privileged. It comes into a different class, because the kind of hierarchies of empire were created at home. And this is a really long way around of showing you just by a word how these kind of decolonization of thought can happen through multilinguality, and just like pulling on that thread can unravel so much lost history, and shared history. Thank you.
We have time for one more question, if there's.
I'd like to say one last thing. The book's really got a lot of intertextuality in it. So if you are interested in revolutionary poetics, then I hope you'll discover some new voices through reading it, from June Jordan and Claudia Rankine to Norbise Philip and Bell Hooks, and so on and so on. So it's really a kind of web of connection of texts as well.